Hello everybody, I'm Jenny Aberle, the high school ELA instructional lead, and today I want to talk to you about independent reading and remote book clubs and how you can implement and support those practices in an NTI setting. We know that learning together in a space is much more optimal during this time, but sometimes we have to revert to videos. So as you watch the slide deck, you'll also want to have the actual slide deck open so that you can access the various links that are within it, because we have a lot of different links and videos. And down there you can see the bit.ly where you can access that. So you'll want to type that in. So during this time, 2020 has turned out to be a difficult year for us with schooling and lots of changes. And we know that reading is important for students no matter what. And so we want to keep them reading through independent reading and through remote book clubs at least once or twice a week, if not every day. And we want kids to be able to talk about the books that they read, because this can be something positive for them and also get them to interact with other people. I love this quote by Donald Miller from the Book Whisperer. If we give students books, the time and encouragement to read, then they'll read and they'll begin to choose their own books and become readers. We know that many of our students aren't readers, so giving them access and options and choice will help keep them reading. I think that's really important. And then down here below that, you see there's a link to Trevor Noah, where he interviews author Jason Reynolds. So that would be a great resource for you to look at, and maybe even something that you could share with your students about reading. So core principles of independent reading. One of the most important things you can do to support their learning from home is to make sure they're reading each day. And those same core principles that guide independent reading guide book clubs as well. And that's true for NTI. We want to provide students opportunities for student-centered, student-driven learning. And independent reading and book clubs can provide those opportunities for students. So some guidelines or some things to keep in mind for independent reading. Choice is really important, especially for those students who aren't readers or who don't love reading. If we let them choose what they read and give them some autonomy about how and when they read and demonstrate their learning, we'll start to see students take advantage of that opportunity and to read. And we want to encourage daily reading. 20 to 30 minutes a day would be great. But if that's a challenge, maybe start with 10 minutes a day and increasing that each week. Generally, in a classroom setting, teachers will give students 10 minutes of independent reading time every day. We can't monitor that now that we're in NTI, but we can encourage that and maybe even encourage 10 minutes at a time, 2 or 3 times a day. You can look at this chart over here to the right and you can see how much benefit students get when they increase the amount of time they read each day. Right here is about 10 minutes a day. This indicates that a kid's percentile rank will increase to about 70% if they read 10 minutes a day. How many words they read per year will increase. So we want to try to at least get 10 minutes a day, and double that would be even better. So NTI is a great time to encourage kids to read. So you might be wondering, how do I start independent reading? There are a lot of different steps that you could do to do this effectively. Here is a list of them. One of the first things you need to do is communicate with them, the students, their parents, their guardians, this plan around independent reading and the expectations there. Will that be through your syllabus? Will that be through a specific letter that you send home or provide to students? How are you going to communicate the independent reading expectations? Within those expectations, think about how are you going to help your students set goals? What kind of reading choices do they have? What kinds of ways are you going to provide for them to demonstrate their learning or provide end task options? Do you want the parents to be involved? Do you want them to have a sign off on a reading log? Are you going to ask them to read every day, a few days a week, or are you going to do it by minutes? So really think ahead about what you want independent reading to look like in your classroom. If you're considering a letter, which I would highly recommend, there are some samples here. If you click on these links and the slide deck at the bit.ly, you can access these. Those are 3 different samples of letters. I would recommend you maybe take a little bit from all of them to create your own letter. The important thing to remember with independent reading in high school is that students are probably going to choose books that might have some controversial issues in them, that might have some language, that might have some other types of content that a parent should know that students are reading. Some parents won't mind that, but some will. So you just need to make them aware ahead of time that students are having choices and the kinds of things that they might encounter in those young adult books. And you'll see some of that in each of these samples of letters here that you look at. So if you're thinking about independent reading, you need to think about how to guide students to choose the right books for them. A lot of our students aren't readers, and so they don't know how to choose books. So below there are several links here that are surveys and inventories that you can use with your students to help both you and them find out more about what they might be interested in. It's a starting point into that personalization of learning and book choice for students. Again, you can access these links on the bit.ly and look at those there and decide what might be good to use for your students. Independent reading is great as a formative assessment tool and as a component of personalized learning. A lot of times when teachers think of formative assessment, they think of multiple choice questions. Independent reading is not that at all. And to use it as a formative assessment, you do not have to read all of the books that your students are reading. You can still assess them in various ways to find out if they're reading and to find out what they're learning and how they're applying the standards and skills to that reading. So some ways to do that are through conferring, talking to your students about the books that they read, getting to know your students and asking them questions. You can discuss strategies with them. You can talk about the problems that they might be having with books. There are lots of resources for that. Also, talking to students is good because you can make recommendations for other books that they might like to read, or a series of books or topics of books. If a student is reading a book and they really don't like it, there's a resource here if they're just not into that book, and you can click on that and get some ideas for what you can do for a student. But the key to independent reading is really trying to get them in that right book to start out so that they'll want to stick with it. So here are a variety of different ways that you can formatively assess students. You can use their MAP student profile to help determine focus areas. On this slide are multiple links for personalized question stems that are based on standards or skills or concepts around reading that you can use. So your conversation with a student isn't just about whether they like the book or not, or about comprehension or summary, but it's about how they can apply standards and skills to the book that they're reading. So here are several different resources up here on question-based and standard-based stems that you can use. If a student wants to abandon a book, here's a form that you can use. They have to justify why they want to abandon that. You can have them do reading journals, reading response notebooks, and then there are also status of the class examples here. Status of the class is where you kind of keep track of where students are in their books and how they're progressing in their books. So if a student is on page 15 on Monday and on Friday they're on page 20, that lets you know that the student's not really reading or progressing in the book. Whereas if a student is on page 15 on Monday and by Friday they're on page 200, you know that that student is really into the book and is making progress, and you can ask questions around that. There's also a link here for goal setting and some Think, Inc, Pair, Share. Now, a lot of this can be done, obviously, in a classroom setting, but also can be modified for an NTI setting as well. A couple of other resources that you can use with students are independent reading task boards. We're going to look at a couple of slides of those next, but there's the link to those. We provided those to teachers during NTI at the end of this year. And there's also a great resource here that's a video from one of our own JCPS teachers, Emily Sales, where she talks about making connections with independent reading with students. It's a really short video where she talks about how she engaged students with independent reading and some things that she did. And then there's a link to her slide deck as well. This is an example of one of those task boards for independent reading. You can use these or you can modify your own. This one's for 9th, 10th grade. You can see at the top, students can choose a different standard from these 4 choices below to demonstrate their learning. There are questions under each standard. We chose these 4 particular standards because they're high leverage standards for students to demonstrate their knowledge. So standard 2 is themes, central ideas, and details and evidence. Standard 3 deals with character development. Standard 5 deals with the author's choices. And standard 6 deals with the author's perspective. You can use these standards. You can create your own choice board with other standards as well. You don't see standard 1 up here because standard 1 applies to any other standard. That's where students are using textual evidence. So a student could choose which standard they want to demonstrate, and then they could go down here below and choose various ways that they could demonstrate their learning of that standard using their independent reading book. There's a reader's response entry, there's a book talk, you might do a conference, peer-to-peer response. They could do research on an interest or a found poem. There's 8 different resources and ideas there for you. Again, you could take this template and modify it and make it a different way and provide different tasks that students could do each week to demonstrate their learning. So this was one focused on 9th and 10th grade standards. This one is focused on 11th and 12th grade standards. The tasks, I believe, are the same, but the standards are different based on the way they're worded in the 9th, 10 standards and 11, 12 standards. There are ways that you can modify independent reading to work in a virtual setting. Here are some examples. Students may not have access to books, so they'll need access to digital text. We're going to give a list of recommendations and resources for those. For conferring, you can set up Google Hangout to meet with individual students or maybe Google Meets to meet with small groups of them. Try to meet with your students at least once a week or every couple of weeks to talk about the books that they're reading. For student surveys or responses or reading logs, you can create Google Forms for students to complete. There's an example here that was created for middle school. You can make a copy of that and use it or modify it with your own kinds of questions and information that you'd like to gather about students reading on there. You can also use Google Classroom to push out prompts and then have students submit. Again, as a weekly formative assessment, you can use those independent reading task boards. So here are some resources for independent reading. You can click on those links there at the bit.ly and see how students can access various resources. Some of them are book lists. The Louisville Free Public Library has digital books. There are free books there that are mostly classic. Audible sometimes has free books as well. And then there are those task options. Those links are in other slides as well that you could use to help monitor students. So that's independent reading and some ways you can implement that. Remote book clubs would be the next step. So if you're a teacher who's done independent reading before or done book clubs in classrooms before, you might want to try remote book clubs. These would be a great way to get students connected with one another, talking together about books within your classroom. This resource comes from Facing History and Ourselves. Facing History always has amazing resources. They are very student-centered and very thorough. There's a link right here that will take you to the Facing History website and the remote book club resource. What I'm going to share here are some excerpts and some parts from their resource that they provide. So our goal of book clubs is to encourage community and connectedness. We can do that really easily in a classroom setting, but in a remote setting, that's harder. So this gives an opportunity for that. It also gives an opportunity for students to practice perspective taking and empathy. It encourages choice, develops their reading identities, fosters some civil discourse around text, and again, increases reading volume and this passion for books and literature and reading. Some guidelines to keep in mind are to give them choice and autonomy. You might give them a list of some particular books that you want them to choose from, maybe based on our curriculum framework essential questions, or based on a topic or an event. So it doesn't just have to be a total free-for-all, but you want to give students some choice and autonomy in the books that they have. They're going to need to set some reading goals. If students are reading a book together, they're going to have to pace that so that they're prepared for discussions. You want to keep those group sizes manageable. 3 to 5 students in a group is probably pretty manageable. You want to support those clubs. Provide them with resources, ways to get started, converse with them, meet with them, and you want to prioritize engagement with books and each other. This is really important. There are also digital tools that you can use to make these book clubs work. So getting started, you want to identify titles that speak to students' identities and interests. More current young adult titles are generally more interesting to students and engaging as opposed to the traditional canon books that we want to read in ELA. There are some resources here, a lot of them for how to identify books that might be of interest to students, especially by topic. So you can go to those resources. Those are actually linked in the Facing History document. So if you go to that document that I shared when I first introduced book clubs, you can get the links to these resources there. You can see that they're all really engaging and lists that students will want to choose books from. You're going to want to get students interested in them, provide them with those lists of titles that you've curated, a preview of each book so they can make a choice. You might give an introduction to the books with a video or using Padlet or Flipgrid or Screencastify. Maybe read the first paragraph or pages, give short book talks or share book trailers. There are lots of good book trailers out there that you could use and share with students. But you've got to introduce them to the books and help them know what the books are about so that they can make choices based on their interests. Once your students choose books, you're going to create those book clubs. They can self-select into groups of maybe 2 to 4 per title. It might be around a topic or a theme. And once they're in those clubs, you're going to have to help them learn how they meet, how they're going to communicate their learning, whether it will be through emails or blogs or Padlet or virtual meetings. If you look over here to the right side, I've clipped some resources from the Facing History document about what to do if it's too challenging to organize those groups around single titles. It might be around genres or authors or maybe themes. There are so many different ways you can make these work. And you can consider online video chats, written discussions, different ways for students to engage with those book clubs. You're going to have to help your students plan the first meeting, and then let them take over that process. Let them have ownership. One way for them to foster community is to spend that first meeting creating some contracts, a schedule, and a plan, creating norms. There are resources, again, at the Facing History document that are more specific to these resources and for planning. But here are some things students will want to consider. You as well before they actually meet. How many weeks are you going to run the book clubs? And how often do you want them to meet each week? How will they share their contracts or their calendars with you? What technology do you want to leverage? And how are you going to check in with students to support them and monitor their progress? Facing History provides a lot of support resources for you. These can be a unique challenge, but if you look here on the left, these are a list of the support documents that are offered in the Facing History site: creating the contract, getting organized, the schedule, how to have discussions and questions, keeping the discussions alive. And then over here on the right are some questions to consider for support groups, like how prepared are your students going to be to facilitate their own book club? What skills might they have or might you need to help them build? What kind of handouts do you need to provide to them? And how are you going to check in with them? Remember, at the end of the day, we just want to provide students with opportunities to read, to talk about their books, and to connect with one another and foster community around stories. It's not going to be perfect. There are going to be hiccups and struggles along the way to figure out how to make this work. But if we can get students to read and somehow to connect, that's making progress. And we have to celebrate that and learn from it on how to do better the next time. Thank you for your time in learning how to implement independent reading and book clubs during an NTI setting. If you have questions, if you need help, you can always email myself or Jessica Brzezinski, who is the coach for high school ELA. We're happy to talk about this, to coach you through this, and to help you with this process. Thank you, and have a great school year.